Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar we're put in conjunction with our friends here at Lucidity. So following on from the growth webinar last week, the diversification one on Monday, we're now going to talk about getting your pricing strategy right. So it's one of the questions that I get asked a lot by clients, and it's a real interesting look at how different businesses can approach this, because in my experience, each different sector, each different business approaches it in a slightly different way. So we've got Tom and Mike here who will introduce themselves shortly. For those of you that may have any questions throughout the webinar, so if you want to use the question and answer box on the Zoom controls, then it gives us a chance to look at these, and there's time for questions and answers at the end. So I'll now pass over to Tom.
Great, thanks, Mal. So hello, for those new to the series, I'm Tom McCarthy. I'm one of the founders of Lucidity and have a sort of reasonable track record of growing things and turning them around, and got interested in strategy because of all of the things below. And I'm pleased today to be joined with my co-founder, Mike.
Hi there, yeah, I'm Mike, the co-founder of Lucidity, and my background's in tech, AI and product for the last 15 years, and most recently spent a few years in the US growing SaaS there, and I'm really looking forward to today's webinar.
Great. So in terms of the agenda today, just a bit of an introduction, and then looking at competitive strategy and a tool called Bowmans Clock. And then we'll get into a few aspects of sort of product and price positioning, at which point I'll hand over to Mike, who'll actually look at a revenue model rather than just a sort of a pricing discussion, and then back to me to finish off with a couple of pricing strategies. Q&A at the end. Please submit questions. We're more than happy to do Q&A and discussion at the end. So interesting what Malcolm just said actually there, because pricing for us as well is a very, very common question and problem area, particularly with sort of early stage businesses that we mentor. And it really is one of the most powerful aspects of your commercial activity that can drive profit. Because, you know, you could put your prices up tomorrow morning by 10% and see that pretty much drop to the bottom line. And if you consider that with how much it would take you to make the same amount of profit from a new product, there's no real comparison. So pricing, getting your pricing right, is a really, really powerful product driver. But interestingly, in the world of pricing, there's a sort of a fact, in inverted commas, out there that most businesses spend less than 6 hours a year looking at their pricing. So it's very much a sort of a neglected aspect of business. So if there's just one thing that comes out today's call, you know, put something in your diary, quarterly basis. You know, there's so much change going on around us all the time, then surely we should be looking at our pricing on a quarterly basis to review it, recognize change, do some research, and perhaps test some new pricing out. And it is one of the things that actually that is forever annoying, because unless you've got large amounts of data, you're not quite sure you've ever got it right. And I think you just have to accept that. So the way I view it, rather than lose sleep over it, is I just view it as like organizational design, where you're just trying to get it less wrong. And that's how I view it, because you're never quite sure unless you've got a lot of data. There is one sort of thing to point out again as part of the intro is, you know, how critical it is, because, you know, here we've got sort of low to high price on the vertical axis. And if you've got a product or a service that you're selling, and the sales process for that is complex, it's difficult, it's expensive, and you have a low price or a low value per customer, which comes from your pricing, then actually you've got a bad business model. And so this is just a simple, quick example of how critical it is to get your sort of pricing right. You don't want to be in that red quadrant. So a couple of tools, first of all. We are going to look at some tools today, but in a much lighter way than the previous strategy webinars. So we'll move through at speed, and hopefully we'll bring some of these tools to life. So the starting point really, it needs to be your company's competitive strategy, because this will inevitably affect your pricing strategy and your price points. There are 3 competitive strategies, whether anyone sort of likes it or not. Cost leadership. So do you have the skill or different aspects to your business that mean that you can or want to lead the market in terms of cost. So you want to be the lowest cost offering in the market, and that is your competitive strategy. Brands up here we recognize, Lidl, Aldi as the supermarkets, Ryanair, you know, as a very sort of cost-focused airline. Dell, when they started, sort of serious innovation, but that was all about, you know, low-cost product. So that's a cost-based competitive strategy, will no doubt impact your pricing. The second company strategy is one of differentiation. So do you have the creative skills to create products or sell and market products in a creative way where you're focusing on being different? So that is a differentiation strategy, and probably the most recognizable or best example of that would be someone like Apple. Very creative product development, very creative marketing and part of their brand. And then lastly, down the bottom, a strategy that is a focus, and that's all about focusing in on a small subset of a market in a very focused way. So an example here would be someone like Rolls-Royce, where their focus strategy, they are focused on very high net worth people, and that's it. And all of those brands, they have deep, deep understanding of their customers. And that's what that strategy is all about. It's about a huge depth of understanding of a narrow market. So that is sort of question number one for everyone on the call. What's your competitive strategy? There are pros and cons to these strategies, and obviously we'll be distributing the slides. Please have a look at these. Now, you know, some of these could be choices. Do you really want to run an incredibly low cost business, or does your sort of interest, skill and behavior sort of fit with more with differentiation? And that's certainly the case for me personally. The question that you need to ask yourselves here is, you know, what are the advantages and disadvantages of these strategies for your business, and which ones do you really actually want to sort of sit in? Another tool you can use that sort of takes this thinking on just in a bit more detail, really, slightly more depth, is something called Bowmans Strategy Clock. And again, if we just bash some brands around here for you, this again is for you to consider, well, where are you, or where do you want to be? And, you know, again, these brands around here should sort of help you just understand, you know, each of these positions. We had an interesting sort of brainstorm in the office. Actually, we're trying to think of the risky high margin, number 6. And Nurofen is an interesting example. You know, how do Nurofen get away with £4 or £5 for a box when you could buy an own brand product from a supermarket for about 30p? It's because scientifically they're exactly the same. So this is an interesting tool to use if you look at your own market and consider where your competitors are, because you might be able to then sort of understand some decisions that they've made or some approaches that they're taking. So there's a couple of tools to get started. The next sort of section from me is around product and price positioning. Now, there's a sort of quite a well-known tool called a brand perception map, which typically looks like low to high price on the vertical, and then a quality spectrum on the horizontal. And I'm not hugely interested in cars, but if we use cars as brands that everyone can recognize, so typically a tool like this is used where you've got, you know, your low price and your low quality down on the bottom left, through to the Ferraris and the Rolls Royces top right. Now, we actually use this in a slightly different way, and I'm going to talk about ourselves here as an example, because we had to wrestle with this quite a lot when we first started. We wanted to understand, we're about strategy, we're a software product. So what are the options for our customers when it comes to figuring out what their strategy should be and then to make it happen? So definitely, you know, there are cheap and expensive options out in the marketplace. And then the horizontal axis for us, for our business, was what are the options out there that are difficult, time consuming and incomplete on the left? And what are the options out there on the right that are really easy, fast and complete if you're trying to figure out your strategy and make it happen? And so for us, this is what the options for our customers look like. And the reason we're doing this is we're trying to figure out where do we want to sit in terms of value and sort of pricing. So this is about choice. Strategy is always about choice. So on the left here, if you're trying to figure out your strategy and make it happen, you could buy some books, £100, but it's incomplete because you then got to make it happen. You could put yourself on a training course of 500 quid, but again, you come out of the course, you've still got to make it happen. You could spend £40,000 on an MBA at INSEAD, but again, you've still got to make it happen. If we move across to the right, then you could spend 5K, 10K on a consultant or $1 million with McKinsey. Now, McKinsey are expensive, but they will do the whole thing for you and even make it happen. So they are the options for our customers when it comes to strategy. And we wanted to position ourselves as a business, as a product, and in terms of pricing in the bottom right-hand quadrant, being easy, fast, and complete, but affordable as well. The second approach that you should take when you're thinking about positioning is here too. So we're a software product. Now, when you normally try to sell something to a customer, particularly in the SME space, they very quickly compare you to other price points for other products. So nothing to do with your product, but just other software products in our case. So for example, a CRM platform like HubSpot or Salesforce, something like that. We don't compete with them, but we do when it comes to actually the cash and the price points. We compete in the customer's mind. And for a service platform, for example, how much does a customer pay for something like Freshdesk or Zendesk, for example? And this is another sort of simple bit of thinking that you should go through just to think about how you compare to other customer alternatives, not your direct competitors, but things that you are definitely competing for. You're competing for the same cash with that particular customer. So there's another couple of sort of, again, background thinking. Now, we're going to have a quick look at price sensitivity. And so if you wouldn't mind, what we're going to do is a very quick poll, which Megan will put up, and we call this the haircut. And the question is, at what point would you consider a haircut too expensive? And the second question is, at what point do you consider a haircut too cheap? So if you wouldn't mind just taking a few seconds to answer those two questions, and then we'll have a quick look at the answers. Great. Okay, so at what point do you consider a haircut too expensive? I would love to do this around the country. Malk, we'll let you know how that goes. Okay, so 57% are basically saying probably 30 quid, so between 20 and 30 quid. And at 30 quid, sort of most people are starting to think it's too expensive. Okay, that's interesting. And then Megan, the second question about, oh, here we go, I can move down there. And then basically, in terms of at what point is it too cheap, then people are bottoming out at about a tenner. But some people are going down to £3. That's interesting. Okay, so what we're doing there, that was just a quick bit of market research, if you like. There's a tool which we can circulate called Price Sensitivity Meter. And what it is used for, as we did there, is to figure out at what price do customers think that your product or your price point is too expensive, and they're not willing to pay that. If we come down a little bit, there's a price point where actually customers will think it's expensive, but they will buy it because there's a perceived quality. If we come further down to the yellow, there is a price point at which people think it's cheap, but they will buy it. So that's a bargain. People think, okay, that's a bargain, I'll take it. And then right at the bottom, and what we were exploring there with a haircut, which everyone can relate to, of course, particularly in lockdown, at what point does pricing become too cheap and actually people aren't willing to buy? So that's an interesting little exercise. And this sort of price sensitivity will affect your product, service, whatever it is you're doing. And again, this is a relatively easy thing to do to sharpen up your understanding of your pricing and feeding into your pricing strategy, because it's actually quite easy to do some research with family and friends, business contacts, or of course, you could put out simple client surveys or other surveys. You could get an agency to do it if you wanted to do, a large scale B2C piece of research. And so, we'll drop that tool out if people need that to come up with a proper framework and figure out what those price points are for your product. And then you can figure out where you want to position yourselves within that price range. So that's all from me at the moment. At this point, what I'm going to do is hand over to Mike. And the reason for this next section is quite often we talk to businesses and they're worried or wondering about what price point they should be coming up with. And actually on discussion, it's more a case of a revenue model question rather than a price point question. So Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so yeah, as Tom has just said, we are talking today about price point and the various tools that can be used when setting it. But it's important to note that price point is really only one part of your overall revenue model, and the other parts can have as big an impact on your profitability and success. So I'm using the revenue model here from Ron Mayer, who's a professor of strategic leadership. As you can see, the model has 5 parts, and all of them have equal importance in how you monetize your business. It's a great framework. It's designed to help you innovate around your price points and challenge your standard approach to making money. So the first part of this revenue model is who pays. That's often the client, but doesn't have to be the client. There are many successful businesses out there where the end user doesn't pay a penny. Facebook or Freeview TV are great examples. So in your business, who's best to pay? Is it your client, an advertiser, a partner, a sponsor? It's a really important question to think about. The next section of the revenue model is what is paid. And in many cases, this will be money. But in other cases, it could be currency such as data, insight, getting the customers to do certain activities or behavior, referrals from partners, crypto, or other value-generating assets. The third part is what is actually being paid for. And we encounter many different approaches every day. So for example, you may go to the shop and buy a Twix, and that's a simple per item transaction. Too many Twixes and you'll be signing up for a gym, which is a per user access or usage model. If you're in the gym, you'll be offered classes or a personal trainer, which are both examples of add-on pricing. And finally, if you injure yourself, you'll be approached by many lawyers offering a no-win, no-fee model, otherwise known as results-based. The fourth part is how are you actually paid? Is it a subscription or a lease or a one-off or credit? That's a really important part, and we're going to touch on that in a bit more detail shortly. And then the final part of the revenue model is actually the price point itself. So are you factoring in things like seasonal or dynamic pricing, volume discount or auctions, or is it a set price point? So as you can see, this model has 5 parts and they all work together in order for you to go to market with a revenue model that gives you the most growth possible. Let's look at some examples. So we've got Apple Care. That's an insurance policy that Apple provide for their products. The end user pays with money for protection via a subscription at about £99 per year. Physical newspaper is purchased by the reader with money for the physical paper as a one-off at around £2. Facebook has advertisers who pay with money to access audience data, generally on a one-off basis whenever they want to access their advertisement system, and the pricing is dynamic. Facebook also require a second revenue model where the end user pays with their own data to access the social network via a subscription. And then finally, SaaS is a product that is paid for by a company with money, often per user and on a subscription model. So there's lots of different ways that you can combine these different columns to give you different revenue models for your market. Okay, so I want to touch on 2 important parts of the revenue model and where more successful businesses sit. The 2 focus areas are one-off payments versus recurring and single versus multiple revenue streams. Many businesses will have multiple revenue models because it comes with lots of benefits. You'll have less risk if you have multiple products because you're less reliant on market conditions that may impact one of them. So for example, as one declines, others may rise. Your products may also complement each other, resulting in both going stronger because of each other. Your company will find new opportunities by developing new revenue streams because it expands knowledge and capability. And it's generally easier to innovate. Companies with more than one revenue stream find it easier to conceptually move to this model than companies that are reliant on a single activity. So let's take Apple as an example. They began with a Mac, and they've now got numerous products from phones to watches to tablets to headphones, all of which means there's less risk on the company than if it just sold computers. Second point to raise is around recurring revenue. This is really key, as it's significantly easier to grow when you've got recurring revenue rather than one-off revenue. Benefits here include easier to innovate because you know what money is coming into the business and therefore you know how much you can invest. It's easier to focus on customers because the relationships are longer and stronger. It allows you to grow new revenue streams because you have that existing customer base to target. Your company will be more resilient even in tough times because you've got the base contracted revenue coming in. And overall, the customer experience improves because it's so fundamental to success that, well, it has to improve. Moving to recurring revenues is something that many companies are doing now. So if we go back to our Apple example, multiple revenue streams, as we showed before, but in the last few years, they've also launched a significant number of subscription services. So music, credit card, TV, arcade, cloud storage, and most recently fitness are all examples of services that users sign up for and pay monthly or annually as opposed to one-off costs. Okay, so let's look at some common recurring revenue examples. There are tens of thousands of membership organizations out there where end users or companies subscribe to be a member, receive news, information, and access to events. Professional bodies like ACCA, CIPD, organizations like Greenpeace, or even fan clubs have this model. SaaS products, they power millions of companies across the world. Some examples include Lucidity, of course, to power your strategy and growth, HubSpot to focus on your marketing, and Xero for your bookkeeping. Physical product subscriptions have grown in popularity over time. HelloFresh being an example of a company that deliver boxes of food to your door each week with recipes, whilst Dollar Shave Club is an extremely successful company that shook up the shaving industry by delivering cheap, high-quality razors as a subscription. Sometimes partnering with another company is a way to generate or improve recurring revenues. So for example, Spotify partnered with Uber to provide users with a soundtrack to their ride. And finally, service plans, probably the most common model out there and oldest in areas such as insurance or utilities, where a customer will pay on a monthly or annual basis in order to have some sort of service. Okay, so some key takeaways from this section. Firstly, develop your revenue model. Don't just focus on one part of it. And even if you've got a successful revenue model, challenge it with this framework. Secondly, the most successful companies have multiple revenue streams and they generate value in different ways. So consider how your business could have multiple revenue streams. Remember the Facebook example where users essentially give up their data to use the system whilst advertisers pay for the data? Or the Apple example where they have multiple products that people buy and then they sell services on top of those products. Finally, lean towards recurring revenues. If you can find a model that works for you and is recurring, then you're more likely to grow longer term.
Thanks, Mike. So that's interesting. I mean, we touched on in one of the earlier webinars, whether it was growth or diversification, I can't remember, but there was definitely a case study in there, one of the businesses we worked with, and they moved from just a day rate model. So they had people provided a service, but on a day rate model. And they diversified. Yes, it was a diversification webinar. They diversified to add in a software platform, and that was sold on is sold on a license, on an annual license, and that has transformed that business in terms of growth and revenues and profitability by, sort of by a factor of sort of 8 to 10 in only a few years in terms of growth. I personally think it is so much easier to grow a business, to scale a business when you've got recurring revenues coming in, particularly on longer term contracts, because you know what money is in the bank in 1, 2, or even 3 years' time. And so much easier to grow, I think, than one-off transactions, day rate models, et cetera, et cetera. So it is, I can already see some questions coming in that we'll come to around the additional demands that poses, or the challenges that poses. but as a growth catalyst, recurring revenues, I think are extraordinary. So the last piece I'll touch on here is the three sort of classic pricing strategies, ranging from sort of simple to sophisticated. So the first one is, and I'm sure everyone can sort of recognize this, and we don't need to sort of hugely dwell on it, but cost plus. You know, so what it costs, put a margin on the top, and there's your price. So the simplest method, you know, no need for lots of research. You basically just got to get your sums right. And actually it is good for certain businesses. So cost plus, good for simple businesses, actually good for service businesses, good for resellers, or actually if you have a large portfolio of products to manage and you want to manage them in a simple way, then actually cost plus is a good way to manage a large portfolio. But it is definitely bad for certain businesses. So for example, software companies, businesses with a lot of competitors, and you know, it's not a way to maximize profit, but it's simple. Now, most businesses, I don't have data on this actually, but it's a personal observation, but I think that most businesses tend to take the second pricing strategy of competitor based, where you are looking at what your competitors are up to, direct competitors in a market, and you're effectively copying them. Now, there are some benefits to this. It's sort of quick, and you know, you can get a lot of value if there is a competitor in a marketplace who's been there a long time, they are successful, then you can imagine that they have over time got their pricing right. And therefore, if you're copying it in inverted commas, then you're largely getting it right too. And you won't be too expensive, and you won't be too cheap. You know, your price sensitivity will be good. And you know, if you're entering a market, it's a quick way to do your pricing. Have a look, copy. However, you know, the shortcomings of competitor-based pricing are, I think, quite sort of fundamental. The big one for me is that actually it's not your pricing, it's someone else's. And you're focusing on your competitors rather than your customers. So speaking personally, it doesn't sort of sit well for me, because you know, it's not about your customers, you're using someone else's pricing. And so over on the right there, if you want to be seen as innovative, fresh, new, exciting, then of course just showing up with pricing that looks like your competition, you know, that's not the way to, that you're not going to be seen as fresh and innovative if you just look like a competitor. It does help you get moving quickly. It does, you know, it's good for mature markets. If you can differentiate with perhaps a slightly different approach to service on top of your product, then actually it can work well. But on the right there, it does have some shortcomings. So lastly, we come to value-based pricing, which I think is generally considered to be the best pricing strategy if you want to really maximize products. Value-based pricing is really around, the key thing here is a really good depth of knowledge about your customers, and also being able to translate that depth of knowledge into some excellent sales and marketing. So value-based pricing is all about understanding customers to then identify, you know, and understand what is going to push up, you know, the perceived value of your product in your customers' eyes. You know, how does your product or service reduce their problems? Why is it desirable to them? So you've really got to get into the sort of detailed understanding around these sorts of questions, and then understanding those things will help you understand your value and in practice push your price up. Equally though, there is a sort of downward pressure on your price point here, because what uncertainty is there around your product, or even you as a supplier? What costs migrate to you? You know, what are the migration costs? If you're trying to sell a new service or product to a customer, what are the migration costs? That would have downward impact, and also any historical resistance to a product such as you. So those things are sort of going to push your pricing down and decrease the value. If we look at this, I'll try to sort of use an example. And this is in the cybersecurity space. So this was a new product that was created. And value-based pricing was definitely the way to go. They really wanted to maximize value, maximize profitability. And so value-based pricing sort of got the focus from day one. And that particular product for the customer, the green, so the value creating aspects, was it gave fantastic visibility and peace of mind. So it was reducing risk. So there was huge value on just giving customers peace of mind. There were very sort of tangible benefits to it around cost management and cost reduction. There were operational benefits to it around, improving communication within a business. It saved time, it took hassle away, it made things more effective and more efficient. So they were all of the sort of the value creating aspects of the product that particular team started to understand, by discussing, getting in some really detailed conversation with their customers and understanding their customers. On the flip side, what pushed that value down was there were some variable costs to it, and some people didn't like the variable nature of the cost. There was some possible questions around the credibility of the business. It was quite small at the time. Staff would need to be retained. There were existing contracts in there with other suppliers. So there was a cost to change, there was a time to change, and a resource to change. So they are real examples of things going on with a customer that would push down the value. But that very real example has become a really successful product. It's incredibly well priced, in that it's quite highly priced, but it delivers a lot of value to customers, and therefore customers are willing to pay that. The profitability on the product is really, really quite high, and that's great for that particular business. So value-based pricing, I think, is the best strategy to follow. So really understand your customers in detail, and go through that process of identifying value that pushes price up, and the things that push price down. But if you really want to maximize your profit, that is work that is worth doing. It does take some time and effort to do this well, and it does also sort of take some skill. So you need, I would say, you need some, to have some capability or resource in sales and marketing, to get this right. But it's brilliant, in terms of building your brand, reputation, etc. It's good for smaller businesses, and also actually it's good for specialized businesses as well, and value-based pricing. We don't really see any downsides to value-based pricing, as long as you've got the sort of skills in-house to be able to do it, and you've got the time to do it, and also access to customers that can give you that level of understanding. I guess that is a bit of a prerequisite. So in terms of summary of key points, and then we'll get into sort of Q&A and discussion, because I can see there's some questions coming in. Going right the way back to the beginning, spending time on your pricing is time well spent. As I mentioned, most businesses not spending more than 6 hours. You can, spending time on a regular basis on your pricing is a very smart move. Consider your company strategy, because it obviously has your competitive strategy, because it obviously impacts your pricing. If your company is following a competitive strategy that's around cost leadership, of course, that's going to dictate what your pricing strategy is. Really, really understand, what we skimmed through some tools there, 3 or 4 different tools, and they were all looking at what are the customer's options, what's the whole range of the customer's options, indirect competitors, direct competitors, products that are tangential for you. That again is really sort of time well spent. And do some proper research. The haircut, that was a quick exercise, in a light-hearted way, but actually there's some seriousness to that. Do you understand where your customers, the price at which they are willing to pay, even though they see it as expensive? And equally, where is the point that they see things as a bargain, or in fact too cheap? I think the recurring revenue model that Mike sort of touched on, I think that is always possible. The biggest and baddest example out there is actually Dollar Shave Club. you know, that's going back some years now, but $250,000 worth of razors sat in a warehouse turned into a business that was sold to, I think it was Procter & Gamble or Unilever, one of the two. But that business was sold for more than $1 billion. And that was, you know, if someone can turn boxes of razors into a recurring revenue stream, then as far as I'm concerned, you know, anything can be turned into a recurring revenue stream. And then lastly, you know, we looked at the 3 core pricing strategies. So these are strategies, not tactics. Tactics is a whole other webinar. Cost plus, competitive, and ideally value-based. Really understand your customers, what they value, because if you really want to maximize profit, that's where you need to spend your time and effort. So very quickly on us, if you've been on one of these webinars before, then you know you've seen this before, but we are a software business. We're focused on helping businesses grow through good strategy formulation and execution. So we built out a product that helps customers, businesses, SMEs, mid-market businesses of all sectors formulate a plan, execute it, be able to see what's going on, and really importantly, communicate to different stakeholders, whether they be employees or investors. We work with all sorts of different types of business, all of our customers there in the middle. Everyone's trying to grow and manage that growth successfully. So we really find that fascinating and love that. And we have customers with teams all over the world, actually. So, of course, we support remote collaboration. That sort of goes without saying as a software platform. So, Malcolm, I think at this point, it's over to you to share any of the questions that have come in.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Mike. So thank you for all those that have submitted a question. Got quite a few. So I'll just take them in the order in which they arrived. So the first one, so probably a question for you both. Is there a risk that too many products or services or revenue streams can split focus and weaken the business? Essentially, can you have too much going on?
Yeah, I think the answer to that, the simple answer to that is yes, you can. You know, you can, you know, if you think about back to some of the other strategy webinars we've had, then, you know, we've made the point that strategy is about choice. And I think as long as you're focused on revenues that are good, solid, you know, growing, profitable, etc., that's fine. But you could, you know, we do sort of sometimes see businesses struggling because they have got too many things in their portfolio, some of which are unprofitable, and they're not killing them off quick enough. Okay,
thank you. And one final question on recurring revenue, just to, if you like, complete the loop. So with obviously in the world in which I am, a lot of the accounting subscriptions, the likes of the Xeros of this world, move on a monthly subscription.
Right.
Whereas if you like, when subscriptions first came around, and some providers will offer an annual subscription instead, sometimes at a discount. So what would be your recommendation?
Well, okay, this is interesting. So we used to run a business, both Mike and I, we used to run a business where we were operating on annual contracts and actually 3-year terms. And it was brilliant because we, you know, we had fantastic predictability of what revenues and cash we had in the bank. It really helped us grow that business because we knew what we could invest, etc. And that was great. However, I think times have changed. So that was like, you know, a few years ago. I think times have changed. So I think there is a much more of an expectation now to pay on a monthly basis. It is possible to get annual agreements for sure. But I think it's much harder than it was years ago. And also, for example, it depends what territory, because, you know, getting a 12-month agreement in the States is much, much harder than getting a 12-month agreement in Europe, for example. So I mean, obviously, if you can get the long-term contracts in place, it's really good for your business because you've got predictability around your cash. But, you know, it really depends on the marketplace. What are competitors up to? Where in the world are you, etc. So there's a whole bunch of issues there that are somewhat outside of your control.
You should definitely always offer annual and push annual where you can, because as Tom says, it's better for cash flow, it's more stable, reduces churn, but also the commitment from the customer to use the system for a year means you've got more opportunity to work with them, get to know them, and really get them to understand the value of your product.
Okay, and yeah, I've noticed from some of the software we use that if you like, the discount offered for annual subscription varies. So is that something that you calculate by referencing churn, or is it other industry standards?
Well, actually, that's interesting. People respond, there is some research out there that say people respond twice as positively to time-based discounts than percentages. So instead of giving someone 8% off, they're more likely to go for an annual payment if they get a month free, if you see what I mean.
Okay.
So that's a little trick, if you like, if you want to sort of offer discounts, make them time-based. The other thing I was just thinking, Malk, when you were asking that question is getting people to sign up for annual contracts is really, really beneficial to the business. And actually, just putting in place the right sales training for your sales team so that they can go and do that negotiation and they know how to sell that. You're talking about a couple of hours worth of work with your sales team that could just transform your performance in terms of going and nailing those contracts. And that's often overlooked. The difference between a sales team bringing in annual deals or 2-year deals versus a month can actually just be a matter of small amount of training. And that's something a lot of people don't really consider.
It's probably worth also thinking that the customer won't be making their decision about monthly or annual necessarily when they first buy. So we see a lot of people start on monthly and then they switch to annual within the first kind of month or two. So making sure that whatever you offer, service or product, you've always got that opportunity for the customer to flip to an annual payment at any point.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, because I think the biggest example in my world is probably the move with Xero and Sage. So for years, Sage worked on an annual subscription model. People paid it religiously, and then Xero came along with the monthly subscription, 30 days notice, and as that product grew and developed and became equal or better to Sage in certain aspects, then the sort of migration of customers from one to the other happened. What would you have recommended if you were in Sage's shoes, say 5 years ago, as that sort of tide began to turn?
So Sage didn't react quickly in terms of having a fresh product with a nice UI or an attractive price point. But if you look at someone like Xero, they've sort of reached a point where they're struggling to maintain the growth from the model that they've got. So they're now wondering about, what other services and products can they utilize, because the majority of their customer base are on a reasonably cheap plan on a monthly basis.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Thank you. So just looking at the next questions, so very much a theme around value-based pricing. So the first one is, would you say that it is harder to get value-based pricing right in business to business because budgets are always such a factor with purchase decisions?
Oh, that's a tough question. Is it harder to get it right in B2B? I guess, I guess there's a reality, isn't there? If someone's got a particular budget and it's fixed and you're rocking up with some pricing that is rightly based on value, but over the budget, then I guess you've got a negotiation on your hands, right? So then I guess it sort of really comes into negotiation skills and salesmanship. Can a deal be structured, around the budget? I guess in answer to the question, the answer to that question is yes, it is more difficult because that's the reality of someone having a fixed budget, isn't it?
Yeah, and like I said, it's sort of putting my finance director hat on. There's a budget there for a reason. So, yeah, you've agreed on that. That's part of your overall plan. Obviously, linking it to the strategy, so it's there as a control mechanism. Now, if there are very good reasons why that budget can be changed, or there's a variant on that budget. I think it's got that sale has got to be even more convincing than it perhaps would have been.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Next one, hopefully a bit easier. How would you recommend testing your value-based pricing?
Okay, well, if I go first, well, I would do some price sensitivity work. You know, and you could, you know, do a large survey or bring your friends. There is a bit of a rule of thumb in sales, at least in technology sales, whereby if you keep putting your pricing up and you lose 20% of your sales on pricing, you've reached the right point. So you know, there is a certain belief in that out there. Whether you agree with that or not, I don't know, but that's certainly an approach that I know certain people take. So if you start to lose a fifth of your sales on price, that you've maxed out your pricing. So that's a way to test it.
Okay, so I noticed that a few of our clients are on the call today. So if any of our clients are happily want to pay us an extra 20%, then obviously let me know. But I'm not going to hold out too much time for that. Okay, and then moving on to the next one. Obviously, with value-based pricing, you are trying to portray a value to your end user, whoever that may be. How important is marketing in that conversation?
So it's very important, and it's part also of the research phase about how to test your value-based pricing. So generally speaking, value-based pricing should focus on one segment. So you know, you're only looking at a single type of customer and what the value is to that customer. So that brings into your marketing personas and the work you do around that. The other aspect of it is to compare with the next best alternative for that customer. So if they don't go for your product or service, what product and service at what price will they get? And what is the value difference between the two? And both of those need marketing really to answer correctly. And once you've got the answer, you then have to build your messaging, get your information hierarchy right, so that you can portray that correctly to your prospects, which is tough to do. And businesses often struggle with actually correctly conveying the value that they give in the product. They often sort of fall back to features of the product.
Yeah,
Tom, you're obviously with your sales history, you'll have found that.
Mike's right. If you look at those three strategies, one that really requires good skills in marketing is value based, because there's two aspects to it. One is really going out and understanding the customers, and then two, translating that into messaging. So Mike's right in what you just said. You know, the other two strategies, cost plus and competitor based, actually, you know, they don't demand much of marketing. You know, cost plus is a bit of a numbers game, and competitive based pricing, you're basically leveraging your competitors' marketing teams, if you look at it like that. So value based is you know, is the way to go, but you do need some marketing skills on the team for sure.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick question for me. How often do you see a sort of hybrid in the model? So a business using cost plus the competitor based and value added for different services or different markets?
Well, you could have someone doing that if there's, say, a physical product, which is cost plus, and then a service wrapped around it, which is more value based. That I'm trying to think of it on the spot. I'm trying to think of an example and I can't. But that hybrid approach would work with a physical product and then a service.
The newspaper industry, where you've got now digital subscriptions for things like the Guardian or the Times, but then you still have that traditional paper you can buy in the shop. Two different pricing models for
okay.
The same.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, thank you, Mike. And next question. What happens with the cost leadership strategy if someone comes in and undercuts you?
Oh, well, that is, I think that was on the slide. That is one of the risks with cost with a cost-based strategy, is if someone, you know, if you're Michael Ryan and Ryanair and someone comes in and underneath you've got a problem. and so you've got to, you would have to take cost out of your business or change your competitive strategy. So that's one of the risks to a cost-based competitive strategy.
If someone goes in at a cheaper price, you're no longer a cost leadership strategy, you're a low price strategy.
Yeah. So with that in mind, what's your take on, reading yesterday that I think some of the bigger supermarkets or traditional supermarkets, the Tesco's and Sainsbury's of this world, are now moving to a price match with the likes of Aldi.
But only on certain products. So I think that's interesting marketing, that they're sort of trying to identify the different products where they can afford to take a cost leadership approach that they think will resonate with the customers, but they're maintaining the price points on a whole wealth of other products that they have, which are probably still more expensive than Aldi or Lidl.
So that's probably then another example of the sort of hybrid approach you just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And I think the other thing just that I've seen, and just more of an observation and a question, is you may not be using cost plus as a pricing method, but a lot of the work we see when we first start speaking to people is getting a proper understanding of the cost of each and every sale. Because otherwise you're probably then into the territory, again, touching on what we saw on some of the earlier webinars, where for example, five forces, where it may no longer be a market that you want to be in.
No, exactly. If you're right at the beginning of the presentation, looking at the sort of cost of acquisition, if that obviously starts to go over your price, then you got a problem. And generally speaking, I think businesses tend to underestimate their cost of sale and their customer acquisition costs, generally speaking. So that is something to watch out for.
No, I'd agree with that. So again, a lot of people can quote a margin or a margin they're working to, but once you take into account all the associated costs, and again, that's a lot of the work we do, is making sure that they're recognised in the right place. But and then you've got a chance of monitoring the other half of how well you're doing with your pricing decisions.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, just conscious of time, so there's a couple more questions, but I think if it's okay with everyone, we'll just come back to you individually on those, because there's a few that are a bit more specific than the general questions we've had. So like I said at the very start, this is webinar number 3 of 4. So the fourth one is aimed around those that have with a sort of financial background, and how we can have an impact with regards to driving strategy within a business. So for a lot of people on the call today, probably with a sales or an operations background, it might be an idea to mention that to your colleagues. That webinar is on Wednesday the 24th, as you'll see there. So also with the diversification webinar and the growth one, if they are of interest but you didn't have the opportunity to attend at the time, then please get in contact, and we can send copies of the slides and the recording to you. Finally, I'd just like to thank both Tom and Mike once again for their help, and that they're passing on some very valuable tips and their knowledge. If you need to get into contact, then obviously details for Tom and myself are on screen now. And then the final thank you, as always, is for those that do all the hard work behind the scenes. So thank you to Megan and Joe, who are our respective marketing leads.